Thank you for coming for the 2023 Riddy Lecture, and we are absolutely delighted. So someone who's just arriving, there's a handout in the corner there, thank you. We're absolutely delighted to have Professor Nicolette Zeeman from Cambridge, where she's Professor of Medieval and Renaissance English, an enormously distinguished chair that was started for C.S. Lewis and has a string of luminaries, which Nikki joins. It's James Simpson, Jack Bennett, Jill Mann, Helen Cooper, and others. Sorry, handouts in the corner there. So we're absolutely delighted to have her, and many people in the room I can see have connections with Cambridge and know Nikki from there, and other people will be discovering her and her work new or not have the Cambridge connections, but hopefully you'll be discovering her exciting work if you don't already know it. And in fact, one of the things I think I wanted to use in my introduction to Nikki is actually a quote that she writing about David Ayres's work on Piers Plowman, calls it constantly innovative and pugnacious. And I think for me that's actually a way that I would myself think of Nikki's work. It's always her work has really focused on Piers Plowman, but on lots of other things, on music, idolatry, on modern theory, on romance, on philosophy, on French poetry, on schoolroom teaching and mythography. I could keep going on. But at the core of it is working with hard texts, difficult texts, and with approaching and trying to confront their challenging nature. And in doing that, she is always innovative and pugnacious. And her most recent work is on The Art of Disruption, published by OUP in 2020 on Piers Plowman. But my own favorite piece of work is actually something she edited, which again kind of encapsulates what I think is so interesting about her work. It's a collection called Uncertain Knowledge, and it's that sense that knowledge is uncertain. Our way of getting at knowledge is uncertain. Medieval knowledge is uncertain. And so I think what we're going to have today is some more of that sense of the challenges and the complexities of uncertain knowledge. For the challenge for me already in pronouncing the title, the other courtly figure, medieval Paradiastole, is what Nikki's going to talk to us about. But before she comes and talks to us about that, I also want to mention one other thing, which is a part of what makes it so exciting for us to have Nikki here today, which is that her own personal connection to the history of medieval things at York. For those who don't know, Nikki's mother was one of the medievalists who set up the Center for Medieval Studies, Elizabeth Salter. And Nikki told me in the exchange of emails we had before she came, when I was describing where she was going to come, that she used to live in what is now the Spring Lane building, in the little houses that were there. So she really is coming home. But she also told me it was the first time we'd invited her formally to come home. So I'm slightly embarrassed about that, but so wonderful that she's being able to do this now this evening. So I'll turn you over to Nikki, whose own work she also describes as being, recently in that OUP volume, as being a conversation with her mother. So maybe a conversation with medieval studies at York as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that really kind introduction. And it is a real thrill to be back here in York, I have to say. There was a momentary disappointment when I realised I wasn't going to be talking in King's Manor, where, of course, I remember my mother working, and also, of course, visiting and talking to Derek Pearsall, who became a great colleague and friend in later years. After my mother had died. But then, of course, I realised, as Nicola has just said, that I was going to be talking not 100 yards from one of those little green bungalows, as they were. In fact, on the other side of the lake was where I lived. And I have to say that it was great fun living here at the beginning, at the very early stages of York University, when it was still mostly a building site. And I can assure you that the signs that were written on the covered ways shortly after the inception of the university were put there specifically because of me. And they said, please do not cycle on the covered ways. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, so thank you. So according to George Putnam, Allegoria is the courtly figure. The reason for this is that Allegoria is the trope that says one thing but means another, And it stands for shifty talk and hypocrisy, supposedly the defining feature of all courtiers. But there is, I think, another classical and medieval figure that is in contention to be the courtly figure, and this is Paradiastole. Indeed, Putnam describes this figure in slightly similar terms, as he says, useful for excusing a fault, making the best of a bad thing, or turning a signification into a more plausible sense. So in its original form, this figure, Paradiastole, also known in Latin as distinctio, hinges on the idea of the virtues and their so-called adjacent vices. That is, vices that look like virtues even though they're not the same. So good examples would be the virtue of thriftiness and the vice of meanness, or the virtue of courage and the vice of foolhardiness. They look similar, but one is good and one is bad. The classical rhetoricians describe Paradiastole, or distinctio, as a figure that identifies difference in similar things. That is, as I say, phenomena that are crucially unlike as well as like. And when it tends to get used, particularly in classical contexts, the figure tends to function as a kind of method of redescription, whereby one element of the pair is described in terms of the other. So in the Roman law courts, for instance, a figure could be used to attack an opponent. You might think she's spirited, but in fact she's really quite vain. Or to defend a legal client. He's been accused of being wasteful, but in fact he's just a generous chap. The crucial figure then of Paradiastole in its original form is this capacity to juxtapose, to overlay or mask a notional ethical category with another category that looks like it but is not exactly the same. So this is Seneca, for instance. Now, which way am I meant to go? There we go. There are, he says, vices which are next door to virtues, and even that which is lost and debased can resemble that which is upright. So the spendthrift falsely imitates the liberal man. Carelessness looks like ease, rashness like bravery. Seneca describes how vices creep up on us under the names of virtues, or rashness lurks beneath the appellation of bravery. Sluggishness is called moderation. And he also adds that there's great danger if we go astray in these matters. And indeed, one of the main uses of Paradiastole in later centuries is to complicate what seem to be clear moral or epistemological categories through these unsettling forms of likeness. The figure offers opportunities for a whole realm of subtle thought about psychological states and appearances that are different and yet sufficiently similar that it's hard to tell them apart. The figure can be used to explore the way that you might kid yourself that your vices are in fact virtues. I might tell myself that I'm cautious when in fact I'm a bit of a coward, really. Or it can be used to argue that what some people call a vice is in fact not so bad. Well, what's wrong with being a coward after all? It's a pretty good idea, isn't it? I don't want to get hurt. Used in this second way, as you can see, to justify what might be called a vice, Paradiastole often involves a whole range of knowing, worldly wise, even cynical voices that ambiguate what might have been thought to be clear moral distinctions. These worldly wise voices are hard to combat, of course, as in doing so, you risk sounding naively moralizing or perhaps facilely idealistic about your moral categories. The great scholar of early modern Paradiastole is Quentin Skinner. And for Quentin Skinner, he claims, at any rate, that Paradiastole is a characteristically early modern figure. He's written extensively and brilliantly on it, in my view. So he connects the figure with 16th and 17th century social satire, with skepticism, with ironic modes of philosophy, and corrosively cynical versions of political thought. He says, for instance, that the figure is put to sensational use by Machiavelli. He claims that early modern thinkers learned about the figure from classical rhetorical teachings, particularly Quintilian, and claims that it was largely forgotten in the Middle Ages. However, in my recent book on the arts of disruption, I've shown, I think pretty conclusively, that the figure is alive and well in the Middle Ages. It can be found all over the place, in medieval pastoral, contemplative and spiritual writings, in political critique, social satire, and, of course, in Piers Plowman. I've got a couple of examples from the Middle Ages which illustrate one of the aspects that's going to interest me today, particularly this knowing or complicit voice with which Paradiastole is so often associated. This is John Bromyard, for instance, in his 14th century Summa for Preachers, acknowledging how the categories of truth and falsity are constantly undermined by worldly people and worldly voices. He says, "He who knows how to pervert the truth and to disguise falsity so that it looks like the truth is praised and held to be wise by worldly people. He who knows how to engineer malicious tricks and give bad advice is called wise in giving counsel." Bromyard says that a man who tries to destroy someone for an imagined insult is said to be powerful and high-spirited, while lecherous people and gluttons are called good companions. There's a marvellous 14th century English sermon edited by Alan Fletcher in which the preacher actually dramatises the thoughts and voices of those who redescribe the sin of pride as something good. And Fletcher is thinking particularly of the connection of this sermon and this kind of voice, of course, to late 15th, 16th century drama, where it is very manifest, as many of you may know. So this is this sermon. "For nowadays, though a man be never so prude, he thinks in his heart that there is none so fire, ne so fresh, so lusty, so jocund, so goodly, so manly, so beautiful as he is. Women in their degree, with their gay headies, with their gay headpieces, set up on height, and orned, horned with their fancy horned headdresses, as it were an unreasonable beast, like an irrational beast. And their gay badies, their gay prayer beadies, said with little devotion, What, sir? What, is that pride? Nay, sir, it is cleanliness and honesty." In the same sermon, this is lechery redescribed as love. "If a lecherous man be challenged of his vicious learning and fool sin, anon he will excuse him, be some subtle method, and say it is not so, and swear horribly, or else he will say, he do it more for love than for anything else, for hardily, he that must be in the world must have love." This is John Clanvow, Chaucer's contemporary, alluding to St. Paul, of course, but also using Paradiastole, when he says, "The world clapeth hem foolers that go'n God's ways." He calls them fools, those who go in the way of God, and men clapen him good fellows that are worshipful that go'n the fiend's ways, the way of the fiend. So, just a few examples there. In this lecture, I want to look at some rather different kinds of text, and I'm going to be exploring the work of Paradiastole and this language of adjacency in a very different context. That is, the medieval courtly and secular literature of fin amour, erotic desire or love. At one level, I guess it's scarcely surprising that we find Paradiastole in this literature, given its tendency to appropriate and rework other discourses, whether moral or otherwise, according to the partial and vested interests, agendas of courtly desire. The variously hyperbolic, artful, knowing, manipulative, euphemistic, or even evasive voices of fin amour offer many opportunities for Paradiastole. But what has come to interest me particularly about this project is the way that once we see Paradiastole at work here, this also allows us, I think, to see that it has other dimensions and functions which this literature exploits. And what I want to focus on in particular is a distinctive feature of medieval literature of fin amour, which pretty much from its inception in the songs of the troubadours and early Romance, which is that this literature is also constructed out of multiple contrasting, paradoxical or opposed perspectives on amour or love. This is a literature that famously pivots on a series of borderlines of passion and art, desire and renunciation, submission and coercion, psychological idealism, sex and sexual satisfaction, the praise of women, coupled with misogyny, gender marking, and the pervasive undermining of gender categories. This is a literature that is gameful, it's dialogic and competitive, and in recent years it's also been characterised as pervasively ironic, dialectical, and even sort of structured round contradiction. And if these features explain the fraught history of those earlier scholarly debates about so-called courtly love, they also clearly explain why those debates were never really resolved. Simon Gaunt has explored the role of irony, of what he calls simultaneous affirmation and denial, and the many different attitudes towards love to be found in troubadour poetry, for instance. Sarah Kay has insisted at some length and with some brilliance on the foundational role of contradiction, contrasting positions, opposed interpretations in courtly literature more generally. However, although these multiple perspectives, along with the different versions of desire that they describe, are in some ways, as you can see, unlike, due, and this is the point I kind of want to place some pressure on, due to their shared preoccupation with courtly desire, at some level they are also alike. And insofar as they all describe amour or love, they all have a certain kind of adjacency. They're structured round an assumption about adjacency. And this means that what Gaunt and Kay have called irony and contradiction could also be called a form of paradiastole. The terminology of irony and contradiction, of course, emphasise contrast and opposition in this literature. Paradiastole, on the other hand, with its emphasis on adjacency and seeming likeness, foregrounds how difficult it is to separate these distinct components and manifestations, precisely because at some level they are seen to be connected. And therefore I think paradiastole is useful in this context because it's one way of kind of homing in on, if you like, that palimpsestic way that what might have been thought of as aspects or as distinct aspects or categories of love, in fact, combine and recombine, are seen in and through each other in all sorts of strange and even sometimes disturbing ways in this literature. And this means, I think, what I want to suggest is that this literature is also a springboard that allows us to see some of the distinctive dimensions of paradiastole as a technique of thought. So perhaps just a couple of tentative observations about where I think I'm going before I start. First of all, as you can see, looking at it in this context, paradiastole may not just involve the adjacencies and oppositions of vice and virtue. It might be used to describe any adjacent relationship that involves a dimension of contrast and likeness, whether these are ethical categories or not. And secondly, I guess, the particular evolution and forms of the medieval love literature may also therefore contribute to our understanding of the figure as a technique of thought, and even, I'm going to suggest, as a technique of constructing narrative. Skinner has described how at the Renaissance the figure was provocatively used to, as he puts it, question and probe the conventional wisdom of the age. And I agree that paradiastole is therefore not just a provocative rhetorical figure, but also a subtle and conceptually unsettling tool with the capacity, under this figure of the structure of adjacency, to put all kinds of contrasting concepts and categories up for grabs. However, the important role of paradiastole in the medieval literature of fin amour probably also has something, first of all, to tell us about medieval theories of desire. It probably has something to tell us about the conceptually adventurous nature of this literature, and, as I'm going to suggest, has something to tell us about the evolution of medieval narrative form. And at the same time, this is my final sort of preamble reflection, what Putnam calls paradiastole's capacity to excuse a fault or make the best of a bad thing may also have something to tell us about how the literature of courtly desire manages that balancing act of, on the one hand, endlessly scrutinizing its own internal tensions, if you like, and yet so often also evading and making light of their consequences. So, the focus of my paper is going to be on the Roman de la Rose. Nevertheless, although myself not an Occitaniste, I'm going to take a little risk and have a look at a couple of troubadour lyrics, those texts on which the lyric tradition, if you like, on which the roman is so fundamentally premised. And then I'm going to end with some brief reflections on Troilus and Cressade. I'm afraid I won't get to Machaut's Voardie. So this paper is a bit of an experiment. And before I start, I also must acknowledge a particular debt, and that is to Emma Campbell, who, when I was giving a paper on Paradiastole and Piers Plowman at Warwick in 2019, encouraged me to think a bit more about medieval love literature in this context. So special thanks to Emma. So Bernard de Ventador's, that's right. So up on the screen, you've got translation on your handouts, which is where I provide them. You've also got the Occitan or the French. Bernard de Ventador's canso, Tant I, begins with the dramatic Paradiastole. The song claims that love's joy, joia, changes or disnatures everything for me. Tot me disnatura, he says. Bernard's joy turns winter into spring flowers and cold into warmth, leading the singer to claim hyperbolically that he needs no more than a shirt. He goes ses vestidura, without overclothes, without vestments in winter, because love keeps him warm. So on the one hand, you might say then that the lover's joy has transformed winter into warmth, and yet of course it's still winter, like but unlike, a form of Paradiastole. Immediately after this, however, the singer insists contradictorily that the lover should not lack mesura. It turns out that love, which of course he's just described in wildly hyperbolic terms, must also be measured. Albeit at a more extreme level, what we have here again, you might say, is another version of paradiastolic interplay of like and unlike. Whether hyperbolic or measured, it is still love. Writing of this canso as a whole, Sarah Kay has said, folly is the lover's moderation, sensuality his spiritual vocation, or his pain his joy. And as you can see, what Kay describes in the language of contradiction, I want to describe in the language of Paradiastole, to foreground the way that the song actively confuses or layers up these contradictory polarities of amours, so that they are really intensely hard to differentiate. Simon Gaunt notices of the same canso that it riffs obsessively on this underlying linking term amours, destabilizing it, he says, through a dazzling process of redescription. Bernard's canso, another canso of his, Chantar ne pot gaire valer, exemplifies an altogether more negative version of Paradiastole. This is focused on the term amours, and at line 15, the singer mentions those who criticize or attack love amours. Unreasonable people blaspheme love, he says, but it suffers no harm because love cannot be lessened unless it is common love, amor communaus, sorry. Such attacks then cannot have any effect on love, he says, unless in fact this love is a different kind of love altogether, common love. The singer then goes on to explain that this common love is not actually love, for it is about having aver, possessions, having something, and loves no thing unless it is paid in return. Que re non ama si non pren, if it doesn't receive anything. This is not love, he says. It only has the name and the appearance of love because it does not love without being love paid in return. It has, as say, it only has the name or the appearance of love. A great example of Paradiastole. And even as Bernard makes this paradiastolic distinction, of course, it's complicated in the song as a whole by the various notions of having in play in this song. Earlier on, the singer has said that he's happy to love, even if he knew he would never receive anything. Si j'aurais non sabi haver, if I did not have anything. Later on, however, he insists that the love of two noble lovers is in their accord and their assent, en agradar et en valer. So, which seems to suggest, as you can see, something very different, that love should involve, according to the beloved, what they want. So, is love about having or not? At which point we might also ask how exactly we might distinguish what the singer is asking for from his lady from the avers of amor communaus, common love. What is the relation of these supposedly like and yet unlike versions of amours? One final example. This is a further song, La Douce Voz. And in this song, the singer describes a woman who refuses him as in possession of a cor volage, a fickle heart. He describes her as faithless, faida. In this song, he also talks about those notorious liars of troubadour poetry, those who betray lovers, those who transmit what he calls mauvais message, bad news, and he calls them liars, messengers. However, both these claims are immediately in this lyric revealed to be biased and loaded descriptions, that is, negative paradiastole, in other words, when he adds just after that if these liars had not spoken, he would still be able to enjoy her love. Indeed, in a concluding volte-face in the lyric, he claims that it's their fault that he's spoken badly of the lady at all, intimating that what he has said about her is not true and that he would willingly serve her some more. So, frenetic redescriptions of this sort are completely recognizable as the psychological paradoxes and the self-contradictions of frustrated love. And as I've already noted, to observe these kinds of internal tensions in troubadour lyric is scarcely news. However, I think that to describe these tensions and paradoxes in terms of paradiastole foregrounds the category-bending way that these songs constantly allow concepts that had seemed distinct to blur with and intermingle with each other. And it also, as I say, highlights this provocative and central role of the notion of adjacency in these thought processes. So let's turn to the Roman de la Rose, particularly the first part by Guillaume de Loris. Here, walking out into the dream landscape, as many of you will recall, the lover narrator finds a jardin de déduit, a garden of delight. Surrounding this garden, before he gets into it, however, is a wall on which are painted images of those excluded from the garden. Given that the first of these images are personifications of hatred, covetousness, avarice, and envy, it is clear that they are being imagined as vices. They're images showing the ugliness, the poverty, the psychological misery, the physical wear and tear, even the sickness associated with these sins in the medieval literature of pastoral care. This is perhaps what makes it surprising when the lover narrator also comes across figures of old age and poverty, neither of whom, of course, are traditional vices. As many readers have observed, these personifications are not really moral vices. They are courtly vices. They are all states that make the aristocratic, leisured, money, youth-fetishizing culture of fin amour impossible. And the technique with which Guillaume turns them into courtly vices is, of course, paradiastole. From the very beginning of the poem, the urbane and knowing perspectives of fin amour mean that here the traditional vices will be interpreted and redescribed and supplemented with a few further courtly vices. Hatred, for instance, looks partly like the traditional moral vice, though we might immediately notice an unusual emphasis on her ugliness, her poverty, her dirtiness, which suggests that her offence is as much to do with class, possession, and aesthetics as it is to do with opposing love. Her image was angry and quarrelsome, and most vile in appearance, and not well attired, but looking like a woman wild with fury, forcenée. Her ill-natured and frowning face had a snub nose, and she was hideous, hideux, and filthy, hideously wrapped in a towel. This courtly haine bears an adjacent relationship, as you can see, to the moral hatred, unlike but also like. At the same time, she offends against the culture of fin amour, partly because she does not love, but also, as you can see, because she's uncourtly. Her ugliness and her dysfunctional body are echoed in those of another figure painted on the wall. This is vieillesse, old age, redescribed again as the antithesis of courtliness, wealth, and youth. So childish in her dotage that she could scarcely feed herself. Her beauty was quite spoiled. No beauty, no courtly love, no fin amour. Gaste, it says. And she had become ugly. Hair grew in her ears. I love that. Les oreilles avoir mossy. She had lost all her teeth. Poverty is primarily described again in terms of her offences against courtly culture. She had nothing but a skimpy old sack covered in dreadful patches, which was her tunic and her cloak. She had nothing else to put on and ample opportunity for shivering. She was a little apart from the others, crouching, huddled in a corner like a dog. So these are some of the famous ekphrastic examples of the ekphrastic art of Guillaume de Lorris. But in them, as I think you will see now, we repeatedly hear that knowing, complicit voice of courtly Paradiastole. How could any person of quality put up with these disgusting, decayed, and impoverished people? However, in the roman, Paradiastole is also at work in reverse. At the gate of the garden itself, the garden of delight, is oiseuse, idleness, another traditional moral vice, better known as sloth. But now she's redescribed as the most lovely and beautiful maiden, a courtly virtue who will in due course open the gate to the garden and let the lover in. To excite the desire of the feather-brained, she had sweetly scented breath, a pink and white face, a little full-lipped mouth and a dimpled chin. You could tell from her finery that she had very little to do. When she had combed her hair carefully and decked herself out in her fine clothes, her day's work was done. Elle avait fait sa journée. Her day was finished. As you can see here, I think, these complex tonalities at work in this knowing and non-judgmental redescription of sloth. The paradiastolic voice, now urbanely assuming social consensus, co-opting the reader into its disengaged, more amoral perspective. In the garden, the narrator also meets largesse. His first description of her as well-trained and instructed in the art of doing honour and spending money makes her sound a little perhaps like the pragmatic Aristotelian virtue of magnanimity. But this is magnanimity subtly reshaped in a deliciously bland, faux naïf set of comments about how money makes friends. It's combined, of course, with the obligatory courtly attention to beauty and fine clothing. Largesse was greatly praised and esteemed. She had achieved so much by her generous gifts, son beau don, that wise and foolish alike were entirely at her mercy. If anyone happened to hate her, I believe that she would make him her friend by the great service she did him, and therefore she was dearly loved by rich and poor alike. So she kind of cuts across the social categories. It rather suited her, ce ne lui ciste pas mot, it didn't suit her badly, for the neck to be open and her throat to be disclosed, so that the soft whiteness of her skin showed through her chemise. Shortly afterwards, we meet the sensible and prudent courtoisie, courtesy, whose virtue is to agree with everybody and, of course, to look good. Arguing that is taking any kind of firm moral stand or actually having a principled disagreement, is simply being stupid and irritable. Courtesy was greatly esteemed by everyone. She was neither stupid nor irritable, nice et ombrage, but sensible and prudent. So again, the language of ethics co-opted for its kind of opposite, if you like. Not given to excess, but speaking and answering fairly. She never contradicted anyone, nor did she bear anyone a grudge. She was charming, fair, and comely, with shining dark hair. So, I hope you can see from this kind of plethora of examples that from the very beginning of the roman, Guillaume de Lorris systematically uses Paradiastole and its powers to redescribe the various phenomena that shape, circumscribe, or contrast with the world of fin amour. He uses it to put together personification by personification, piece by contrastive piece, an alternative amoral, urbane and aristocratic world of courtly desire. As the roman's narrativization of the lyric forms of lyric verse of Finalement gets into its stride, however, he uses Paradiastole to home in on the redescription, under the structure of adjacency, of the various dimensions of Finalement itself. So we home in on this kind of the crucial issue, if you like. And there are many elements I could have cited at this stage, but I'm going to home in on a number of examples that focus on what I would call the art of love, as Guillaume describes it. But I should also say, even before I do that even this emphasis on the arts of love stands itself in a kind of paradiastolic tension with a whole other set of discourses in the roman that emphasize the intensity and involuntariness of desire. I'm thinking of passages such as the one where the narrator-lover speaks of being seized with desire for the rose. L'or me priste si grande envie. Desire took me, he says. Or his passivity to the fragrance of the rose that represents the object of desire, that penetrated my very entrails, he says. Or the way that he's shot by the arrows of the god of love. I was seized with a chill. Me priste une fredor. Took him again, me priste. Which has often made me shiver since, he said. I immediately fell backwards. My heart was false and failed me, and I lay for a long time in a swoon. Alongside this narrative of involuntarism, however, from the very beginning of the roman, there is another strand of discourse that points to the courtly and rhetorical arts of love. From the way that this lover sets off into the landscape, lacing up his sleeves as he goes, courtly lacing, it allows you to show multiple levels of cloth in your clothing, as he walks in the landscape, to his many polite interactions with those he meets, as he infiltrates the courtly society of the garden, decorously enters the service of the god of love. In God's name, he says to the god, I give myself up willingly. So from the very outset, in a sense, we see something that we've already seen in those troubadour lyrics, those contradictory elements in the poem's description of love. Is it passion or art, involuntary or cultivated, intentional or accident? They're all paradiastolically overlaid. But the poem also rings a series of more sort of specific or focused paradiastolic redescriptions on this idea of the arts of love. So one version of them, for example, is provided by the god of love, who gives a series of arch commandments, their parodic 10 commandments, I suppose, to the lover when he arrives in his service, which include a series of instructions about courtly behaviour. Here, for example, he prohibits the vice of villainy, that is, base or low or offensive conduct. I desire and command that you abandon low conduct, villainy, forever. Low conduct makes men into vilains. Villainy fait les vilains, makes you into a villain, which is a term with strong class connotations in the Middle Ages. Be very careful not to repeat things about other people which should not be told. Be courteous and approachable, entre et accontable. Speaking gently and reasonably to high and low alike. Be sure never to use rude words. So here's the god of love exploiting that well-established etymological association of the term villainy with low class and the medieval villain. But the god of love tilts it further paradiastolically, turning it into the antithesis of courtliness, here exemplified in a series of very particular actions expected of the lover. Be careful not to repeat things. Be sure not to use rude words. However, a new version of the arts of love appears with a new personification. This is the arrival of ami, friend to the lover. He's a kind of lover's sort of wingman, if you like. Ami is equipped with a panoply of verbal skills and stratagems to help the lover obtain the object of his desire, which the lover will quickly internalize and make his own. When early in the narrative the lover is attacked by a representation, so there are a panoply of personifications, and there are a series of personifications which represent aspects of the rose, the beloved, and one of them is a figure famously called danger, who means rebuff or disdain, who's one of the figures who represents her attempts to keep him at bay. So when the lover is attacked by this figure danger, Ami, the friend, advises that he use some weasel words, and in particular a paradiastolic use of the language of amour, linking amour here with the term acquaintance, meaning conciliation or agreement. Ami recasts amour as a form of friendly accord, now carefully isolated from any reference to erotic desire. Ami tells the lover tells the lover to ask danger to remit his animosity in a spirit of love and conciliation. And this, of course, the lover does with a slew of artfully partial and adjacent formulations. He begs danger for mercy. He apologizes for angering him. He claims love made him do it. He promises not to transgress in any way, and finally asks ingeniously, but of course entirely ambiguously, "Only let me love, I ask nothing else, and if you grant me this, I will do everything you want." Not playing out the implications of what being asked, allowed to love might mean. Further adjacent figures who are crucial to Guillaume's exploration of the arts of love appear in the form of a number of personifications who represent aspects of the rose too, and therefore have a slightly different meaning and status again. Perhaps most important amongst these is the figure Belle Accueil, who represents another aspect of the rose, that is, her fair welcome. Although Belle Accueil is a personified aspect of the rose, he, and there's a whole other discourse we could have about adjacency in terms of some aspects of the rose having a masculine identity as a personification rather than a female one. Simon Gaunt wrote a fabulous article on this. Anyway, although Belle Accueil is a personified aspect of the rose, he shares in and therefore meshes with those courtly arts which we have already seen espoused by the lover and his allies. Belle Accueil uses the same argument-evading, euphemistic, paradiastolic language of courtesy, offering to help and serve the lover. He kind of comes on really strong to the lover, offering to help him along. He pleasantly assures him, "You will suffer no evil or low behaviour, villainy, from me." Albeit adding a rather more ambiguous proviso, he says, "provided you do not behave foolishly." Sorry, I've forgotten to push that on. Anyway, he says, "providing you don't do anything foolish." It is this smooth, argument-evading language of courtliness that, after all, enables communication between the lover and Belle Accueil. Even when Belle Accueil tries to refuse the lover a kiss, again he articulates this refusal passively, claiming that he would like to agree, but that he's under pressure from someone else. He says, "Friend, so help me God, were it not that I should earn the hatred of chastity, I should never refuse it." At the same time, of course, you can see that this pervasive expectation of courtesy, the idea, as we saw earlier, that courtesy never contradicts anyone, puts Belle Accueil at risk of being compromised at every turn. How can he stay polite and say no? Equally important, the text also countenances that possibility that Belle Accueil's reluctance to refuse should really be taken at face value, as a revelation that, in fact, Belle Accueil does not really wish to hold the lover at bay at all. And in that respect, I guess you might say that Belle Accueil's language of refusal or reluctant refusal exemplifies Paradiastole in a form that's particularly confusing, and yet, of course, entirely recognisable from the Western tradition of love literature, the no that might mean no, but that might also be construed as meaning yes. So, Paradiastole appears at every turn in the artful rhetoric of this extraordinary text. But I think you can perhaps also see from these examples how the poem layers up, or rather overlays, its different versions of love and the arts of love. Each one is assertively represented as a distinct personification, as a distinct voice, as a distinct perspective, but at the time each one is also a subtly linked version of something conjoined, this complex of the arts of fin amour. Guillaume's roman, you might say, crab walks its way across these various connectivities, personifying, ventriloquizing, contrasting, and blurring them as it goes. This is, I think, one version of thinking structured in the mode of Paradiastole. And as you can perhaps see, in my view, it also has a great deal to tell us about the emergence and conceptual subtlety of medieval personification narrative, what many people would call allegory. I have some reservations about that. But personification narrative with its complexly contrastive and layered forms of narrative and self-understanding. Jean de Meun, the philosophical and comedic satirical continuator of Guillaume's unfinished roman, gives a new critical and philosophical edge to the thought technique of Paradiastole. He both exaggerates its distinctions and yet also foregrounds some of the more disturbing ways that its categories infiltrate each other. Indeed, there is a sense in which Jean's whole continuation project is one big exercise in Paradiastole. For Jean, of course, rewrites Guillaume's artful, evasive, and open-ended text. It's literally unfinished. So Jean rewrites this narrative of courtly desire, open-ended courtly desire, as a seduction project, enacted, as Jean makes absolutely clear, for the natural purposes of sexual reproduction and the regeneration of the world. Jean's poem famously concludes with a bizarre and graphic allegorical narrative of sexual penetration. And yet, at the same time, the implicit claim of Jean's continuation is that Guillaume's narrative of courtly desire and the project of sexual reproduction are really the same thing. Fin amour is just part of nature's way of ensuring the continuation of the world. So these two versions of love described by Guillaume and Jean may thus seem distinct, but they are in fact paradiastically connected with each other. And of course, these two versions, these two parts of the roman, pivot on the equally paradiastolic figure of the rose, something of a mise en abîme for what happens over the text as a whole, the combined text. If Guillaume's rose is an artfully evasive figure for the lady, it is also at another more oblique level a vivid and sensual figure for sexuality, something that Jean makes absolutely clear in the graphically sexualized ending of his continuation. And I think it's clear to say that throughout the continuation, which I can't speak about at any length, Jean really turns the thought in the mode of Paradiastole into an explicitly philosophical phenomenon, as well as a boldly tensile personification narrative. He kind of ups the ante on everything in the first part. His talky personifications, with their different perspectives on the adjacent categories of love, sexuality, and procreation, play out the logic of Paradiastole in highly contoured forms. I can only mention one of his personifications. Nevertheless, it's a figure who allows us to return once more to that issue of love and its arts. This is La Vieille, the old woman. She first appears in Guillaume's text, and she's appointed to watch over Bel Accueil, Fair Welcome, after he's been imprisoned in a tower when he does actually allow the lover to kiss the rose. He gets into trouble for it and gets locked up. And La Vieille's qualifications for being Bel Accueil's custodian, if you like, is that she knows the arts and the ruses of love. And the assumption is that she will be able to thwart any attempts on the part of the lover to make contact with Bel Accueil in his prison. However, of course, she turns out to be a double-sided figure. For this very knowledge means that she also knows how to conduct a love affair. Just as we saw the ambidextrous quality of the arts of love and the rhetoric of courtesy in the hands of Ami, the lover, and Bel Accueil, We now see that while the knowledge of la vieille could be used to defend against seduction, it can also facilitate it. And this is, of course, what she does, but with a further particular angle or tilt, paradiastolic sort of variant, if you like. Embittered by her own youthful experience of being exploited by young men, la vieille teaches Bel-Accueil how to conduct an affair with a view to making some kind of profit out of it, getting something. She advocates, in other words, what Bernard de Ventadon would have called amour communaus, common love. And yet at the same time, we can also see, I think, that la vieille stands in a very particular relationship of adjacency to Bel-Accueil, because she too represents a kind of fair welcome, albeit one enacted for distinct and different purposes, different and yet strangely alike. It is, after all, la vieille who facilitates the affair by accepting presents for Bel-Accueil from the lover, but again with the same feigned reluctance that we saw Bel-Accueil himself articulating. Were it not that jealousy would know of it, I would gladly accept this little present. So it's not my fault, I'd like to help you. And it is la vieille who offers Bel-Accueil in due course her own art, a new manipulation of the slightly different courtly arts that Bel-Accueil already possesses. So she's kind of complementing her arts with her own suggestions about what he should do. Fair son, she says, fair son, I would like to teach you the games of love, des jeux d'amour, so that when you have learned them, you will not be deceived. Shape yourself according to mon art, my art. For no one who is not well informed will be able to get away without selling something. Now make sure you listen and pay attention and commit everything to memory, for I know all about the truth. So, as I think you can see, just from this one example, Jean de Meun's cynical, comic, and yet deeply philosophical continuation takes the generative work of adjacency to a whole new level, both in his voluble personifications and in the extreme perspectives expounded. And what's famously said about Jean's text is how much of it is talk. Many of his personifications speak for thousands of lines, and their discourses are famously actually also organised round forms of adjacency. They have a kind of famously chiastic structure in which they start at one point, often work their way to an opposed point, and then work their way back to the original point. So adjacency is doing lots of kind of weird conceptual work in the text. Each personification adds a new layer of ingeniously like unlikeness, revealing that Jean is kind of deeply inward with this thought that Paradiastole really is a tool for very strange kinds of thought. So I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I can only gesture towards my very last text, which is a late medieval love poem that is the product of a sustained meditation, I believe, on the paradiastolic rhetoric and thought structures of the jointly authored Roman de la Rose. Chaucer's Troilus Crusade involves many artful local redescriptions of love and manipulations of love's arts and language. Pandarus, of course, is a past master. We might think of Pandarus's response to the discovery of Troilus in Book 1, bedridden and in despair, insisting that his love is hopeless because the lady will never pay attention to a wretch such as him. She knelt to non switch wretch as Eben won. Pandarus immediately goes into overdrive, of course, with an alternative can-do version of love. God, Pandarus, alas, what may this be, that thou despired art thus causeless, that you're despaired for no good reason at all? What liveth not thee, lady, benedicite? While the lady lives, surely there's hope. And Troilus' opinion that of his woe is no curation, that of his woe there is no cure, is ridiculous, as Pandarus says. It's unreasonable. With a classic form of Paradiastole, Pandarus announces that Troilus' reluctance even to share the name of his beloved with him is not wise caution or even true love, but a vice. It is for thy coward hat, it is for your cowardly heart. And for thine ear, you're just too cross, you're just too worked up. And thy foolish willfulness, your foolish willfulness, for one trust, for despair. So he turns Troilus' anxieties back into Paradiastole. Even I'm getting confused now. You know what I mean. Into vices. What woman could love and switch a wretch, exclaims Pandarus, echoing Troilus' own words back at him. But we might also think of Pandarus as the persuader of Crusade. I mean, he's busy throughout the text reformulating things. Here he is, for instance, busy persuading Crusade to take Troilus as a lover, under the anodyne cover of merely asking for her help for Troilus' suffering, to mitigate, if you like, the love that he says will be Troilus' bane, his destruction. The noble Troilus so loveth they, that but ye help, unless you help, it will be his destruction. Lo, here is all. What should he more assire? What more is there to say? Pandarus recasts love not as any kind of promise or substantial commitment, but just as being a bit more welcoming to Troilus. No understand. For you not require to bind you to him through no behest. I don't ask you to bind yourself to him through any promise, but only that you mark him better cheerer, make him just be a little bit more friendly towards him than ye had done ere this, and more a fester. Attempting to preempt her concern about what people might think if they saw Troilus near her house, Pandarus echoes Ami in the Roman, linking amour with accordance, with conciliation, when he insists that this will appear no more than love of friendship. Switch love of friend as reigneth all the tune, he says. He's just going to be a chum. But Chaucer's poem does more than this. Like the Roman, I want to suggest that it also plays out a series of larger adjacencies in its narrative exploration of love. The most obvious of these can be seen in the distinct and yet linked counterpoints represented by the main protagonists. One could play this out in much more detail, but I just want to offer you something kind of schematic, really. Troilus, Pandarus, and Crusade. All three are caught up in the intermeshed languages of love, friendship, and courtesy, in ways that echo those complex relations of the lover, of ami, bel accueil, in the Roman de la Rose. Within this triad, as you can see, Pandarus represents at least one version, I think there are several in this text, of the art of love. He is counterpointed against Troilus, a version of the lover of the Roman, whose involuntarism and incapacity have been exaggerated to a comically extreme degree. Troilus is kind of hopeless. But also, at least for the first three books, let's say. But also, Pandarus is counterpointed against Crusade, a version of the Rose, Bel Accueil, and Danger, whose inattentions have been ramped up in such a way as to render her intensely complex, hard to read, and yet, of course, painfully vulnerable. The poem's analysis of her predicament and of medieval gender politics more generally is famously critical and incisive. But at the same time, all three protagonists, I think, not just Pandarus, play their distinct parts within the engineering of the love affair. Chaucer's subtle interweaving of the courtly rhetorics of desire, persuasion, coercion, protest, and acquiescence works at every level to mesh the various mechanics of how and why the affair happened and what kinds of art and agency are at stake. And so, as you can see, I suppose, in Troilus and Crusade, Paradiastole is also at work structuring even Chaucer's, I'm going to call it, naturalistic romance mode of narrative. So here we've moved outside personification narrative, and we're thinking about mimetic, semi-naturalistic narrative, and we're still seeing some of those structuring effects. If Chaucer hones in unerringly on many of the ambiguities about intention, control, desire, involuntarism that are at stake in the literature of fin amour, Paradiastole provides much of the rhetoric and some of the crucial narrative and conceptual structures with which he does it. Thank you. I'll switch that off. No, I'll keep that on. Okay.
So thank you so much for that intellectual tour de force. That was more than I could have hoped for. More than I'm sure the audience could have hoped for. Also, what was so impressive and powerful is the way it picked up on what I said at the beginning, which is this extraordinary range of your work. So we've been taken from classical rhetoric through medieval sermons into Occitan poetry, into the very, very difficult Roman de la Rose, to Chaucer. We missed out the Voix but I mean, through the languages, through the modes of poetic modes and the like. As I say, we couldn't have hoped for more. And such a wonderful sense of classical rhetorical technique as a mode of thinking, which you showed so powerfully at every turn, and then that switch to it as in the kind of narrative of the Troilus and Crusades. So thank you so much. We do not formally have questions in a paper like this, but you do have an opportunity to ask questions in a more informal environment. There's a wine reception outside, where you can, I'm sure Nikki would be grateful or happy to take questions, maybe not grateful, but I'm happy to take questions. She also needs a drink and a break after that. So thank you so, so much.